Let's consider a few perspectives on the competitiveness of the German industrial sector. To analyze the competitiveness, it's good to look at factors of production. Factors of production are the resources and the inputs used in the production of outputs, with outputs being goods and services. There are many different factors of production, and over time it changes a little what's considered a factor of production, but the three prominent ones I want to touch upon here are knowledge, labor, and capital. And there are others. There's land, there's natural resources and so on, but let's focus on knowledge, labor, and capital. Let's start with the production factor knowledge. One way to measure knowledge is by patents. A patent refers to an intellectual property right granted for the protection of technical inventions. Patents are granted based on patent laws, which we have in basically all countries and internationally. The goal of patent is to stimulate innovation. Hence, the number of patent applications can serve as a characterization of a country's innovative power. So what does the number of patents look like for different countries? What you see here in this chart is the number of patents by country in thousands. China and the US are leading, Japan and Germany are also strong, South Korea is also strong, others, France, UK and the like, are following. And I think this is no big surprise to many. The United States, Japan, South Korea, Germany are well known for their innovativeness, for their strong focus on R&D, research and development. To some, China is a surprise here, but then consider the size of the Chinese economy and the size of the Chinese population. So maybe if I consider the sizes of countries and that Japan has less inhabitants than Germany, even far less than the United States and than China, maybe it's not a fair comparison to look at the absolute number of patents. Maybe we need to normalize it by population. And that's what you see in the second chart, the patents per 1,000 inhabitants. And when we talk here about patents, it's not about patent applications in a given year, but the number of outstanding patents at a given time. And if we normalize it by population, then you see here that the comparison changes a little. China is less pronounced because obviously they have the largest population among these countries. Japan and South Korea stand out, but now also Switzerland stands out. Still, Germany is doing quite okay. Looking at the German patents, where do they come from? Well, we can look at this in two different perspectives. The different types of industry or regionally. If we look at different types of industry, then the prime drivers of these patent numbers for Germany are the automotive sector, the machinery industry and the electronics industry. And if we look at it geographically, then it's Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg and North Rhine-Westphalia who jointly account for about 75% of the patents in Germany. Now, what conclusion can we draw from this? Looking at the production factor knowledge, measured by patents, well, Germany is not world leading, neither in absolute number nor in relative number by population, but is quite okay. So it's among the top countries in the world in this factor. But then the number of patents is an imprecise measure of the production factor knowledge. And I would ask you to think for yourself why number of patents is not a perfect measure. Rather than discussing it here, I turn to another measure which you can apply. And this other measure is the R&D expenditure, the research and development expenditure, which you see here as a share of the GDP, the gross domestic product. What you see there is that South Korea and Israel are leading with something between 4 and 5% of their GDP which they invest in R&D. If I say they invest in their R&D, then this is not a national strategy, this is not a federal budget or the like, but it's the accumulation of R&D expenditures by all the different entities, organizations, firms in that country divided by the GDP. Then you see Sweden, Switzerland, Japan and other countries doing quite well. Germany is at about 3% with many others. The average of the European Union is a little below 2%. So this is a different perspective how to measure the production factor knowledge. But it comes basically to the same conclusion. Germany is not world champion in this, but it's among the top countries in the world in this production factor knowledge. That's clearly something which sets us apart from most other countries. Let us look at another production factor, namely labor. One way to look at labor is via unit labor costs. the amount of labor cost per unit of output. It's used as a benchmark for a country's cost competitiveness. And you see in the formula how unit labor costs are calculated. It's labor cost per employees divided by productivity, so the delivered economic output per worker. And what you see in the rather complex chart below that is a comparison of different countries, and for each of the countries you see unit labor costs and productivity. Unit labor cost is always the left-hand side bar, the darker bar, productivity is the right-hand side bar, the lighter bar, and both of these individually are normalized to 100 for Germany. So let's start with unit labor costs, the left-hand bar, the darker bar per country. What you see there, Germany 100, I said that, it's indexed on that. And then if we compare it, Croatia or Norway, they have higher unit labor costs than Germany. But most other countries you see on this chart have lower, in part substantially lower unit labor costs. Look far to the right for the United States, for example, 79, so more than 20% less unit labor costs, less labor costs per unit of output than in Germany. Or look at Romania, Sweden, other countries, even Denmark, low unit labor costs in most other countries, meaning we have a challenge in cost competitiveness of our manufacturing in Germany. Let's have a brief look at productivity. Again, Germany indexed to 100. There's some other countries more productive. In this data you see Belgium, Finland, Netherlands, Denmark, the United States, Sweden being more productive than Germany. But most other countries are less productive, meaning there's less delivered economic output per worker. But then these two in relation with the labor cost per employee make our overall competitiveness. What do you think is the labor cost per employee in Germany and in other European countries? Do you have an idea? Anyways, considering unit labor costs as a benchmark there, we see that Germany is a rather high cost country. It's expensive to manufacture in Germany compared to manufacturing abroad. So this is a competitive disadvantage for Germany, even if it's good for the standard of living we have in Germany. Let's move on to the next production factor, capital. One way to look at capital is via the foreign trade balance. The foreign trade balance depicts the cross-border trade of national economy by comparing the goods imported and exported to and from other countries. It's also referred to the balance of trade. And what you see here is a timeline of Germany's foreign trade balance in billion euros, starting in 1991. There was 11 billion euros, we had a slight surplus. These were about 0.8% of the GDP. And then you see an almost steady increase, which peaked in 2017. And at the moment we're somewhere between 6 and 7% of our GDP, which is our trade surplus. Now the question to you is this foreign trade balance good or bad? Does it show competitiveness of Germany or lack of competitiveness? What does it mean for our standard of living? What does it mean if our international partners, other countries, look at this trade balance? Now we looked at three different production factors: knowledge, labor, and capital. And for some of them, I've shown you international comparative statistics. Now what do you think? Which other countries are the biggest competitors of Germany if you think about a location for industrial manufacturing, for industrial production? Well, what you see on the next slide are survey results. And what you see is there is the share of answers among companies, what they consider as competitors for Germany as manufacturing location. The United States ranks first, China second, Great Britain third. Also, we need to say that this was a pre-Brexit poll, so it might change a little with Brexit. Nevertheless, the US and China, what do you think? Why are they interesting competitors? Why do companies consider them when thinking about whether to build up their manufacturing site in Germany or abroad in the United States or China? What makes them attractive? Let us come to a conclusion for this section on Germany's international competitiveness. What we've seen is that in terms of knowledge, we're in the upper midfield. In terms of labor cost, we're also in the upper midfield. I didn't talk about natural resources, but there we have a scarcity in Germany. We've seen with the foreign trade balance that Germany's products are strong in demand, and the question is whether we are still strong in demand as a manufacturing location, and what the trend towards Industry 4.0 changes among these competitiveness factors.